Perfect. All right, so my name is Thomas Cremer, and today I'll be talking about the CDC's regulations for biological importations, specifically the CDC Import Permit Program. Next slide, please. So there are many federal programs that have oversight and permitting requirements. Today I'll be talking on behalf of CDC. If we talk at a high level, CDC is responsible for oversight of infectious agents that impact human health. The CDC administers part of the Federal Select Agent Program, or FSAP, which regulates select agents and toxins, and it also administers the CDC Import Permit Program. Also, just briefly mention the United States Department of Agriculture. We tend to overlap with this agency in some ways. And speaking at a high level, they are responsible for oversight of infectious agents that impact animal and plant health. They also administer the other half of the Federal Select Agent Program and have a permitting program as well. Next slide, please. So at the CDC, we have the Division of Select Agents and Toxins, and there are two regulatory programs housed within this division. So the Federal Select Agent Program administers 42 CFR 73 that regulates possession, use, and transfer of select agents and toxins. Those are agents or toxins that pose a high risk to public health, whereas the Import Permit Program has 42 CFR 7154. This is a very broad authority, but is limited to importation. And then this is done to prevent introduction and spread of agents into the United States. Next slide, please. So there are many partners that we work with in the CDC Import Permit Program. One of them is the CDC Division of Global Migration and Quarantine, and you'll hear more from them a little bit later this morning. They have staff at different ports of entry, and they administer a subset of regulations that govern the interstate and international movement of people, animals, and cargo. We also work with the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. Next slide, please. So now I'll move on to specifics of the CDC Import Permit Program. Next slide. So there are three general categories of when an import permit is required from CDC. First off, we have infectious biological agents. So those could be isolates or cultures. These are well-defined materials that you know have maybe a bacterial viral agent in them. Those are the infectious biological agents. We also have infectious substances. So this could be more diagnostic in nature. These are blood, bodily fluids, tissues, a variety of things coming from people or animals that have infectious agents or reasonably suspected to have infectious agents affecting people. And then we also have vectors of disease, which is fairly broad, but generally we're looking at mosquitoes and bats. Now, the types of infectious agents that we permit, it can include viruses, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, or prions. I do want to bring up the point that we do not regulate toxins. They're not infectious. This is a question that we get, but our regulations are specific to infectious agents. Also, suspect select agents can require a permit from CDC, and we'll talk a little bit more on that on the next slide as far as overlap between the Import Permit Program and Federal Select Agent Program. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk just briefly about the Select Agent Program and importation. The directors from the Federal Select Agent Program talked more about this yesterday, but if you're planning to import a select agent or a regulated quantity of select toxin, you'll have to go through the Federal Select Agent Program. For materials that are known or identified as select agents, you need an approved APHIS CDC Form 2. And this is an approval that can only be issued to Federal Select Agent Program registered entities because only those types of entities can receive and possess select agents or select toxins. I do want to note that a CDC import permit is not required in addition to the approved Form 2, and this changed several years ago to help streamline the process. Next slide, please. So in this slide here, I'm going to give everyone an idea of what types of agents we're permitting and what's being requested. And this is all based on 2020. Obviously, 2020 was an unprecedented year. and this is shown in this chart here. So the most requested agent that we received in all of 2020 was for severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, which causes COVID-19. This is very much unprecedented. In the past year, we had no permits for this. The first one came in January of 2020. So it went from no request for this and being a novel agent to being the most requested agent of anything that we saw all year. After SARS-CoV-2, we have human immunodeficiency virus, and really the next 9, these are all fairly steady state. These are our most common agents generally year to year. But we have a human immunodeficiency viruses, the next most common, which also includes viral vectors that are based on that virus, and then hepatitis viruses. So you have your OSHA bloodborne pathogens as generally the most commonly requested agents. After that, we have E. coli, Mycobacterium species, which can include Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's the most common risk group 3 agent we typically see prior to 2020. There's a lot of interest in importing strains that may be antibiotic resistant or have other properties. After that, we have Staphylococcus species, adenovirus, also including viral vectors that are based on this, and then Streptococcus species, Plasmodium species, and Salmonella species. So those are the most common agents that we saw last year. Next slide, please. So generally, when people are importing, it's pretty clear. They're isolates, cultures, maybe diagnostic samples suspected to contain one of these. But there are a few less commonly known materials that may require a permit from CDC. That includes viral vectors, which I mentioned earlier. That includes viral vectors that may be replication effective, but so long as they're still capable of an initial round of infection, they meet the criteria for needing a permit under our regulations. Also, some nucleic acids can require a permit as well. That's generally regarded as the positive stranded RNA viruses. So complete genomic material from a positive stranded RNA virus is capable of reproducing the infectious virus. So we're consistent with our approach in requiring a permit for that, as does the Federal Select Agent Program regulate those nucleic acids from those particular types of select agent viruses. And then lastly, there are exceptions for non-human primates and bats. So both non-human primates and bats have a fairly high potential for zoonotic spillover. It cannot be presumed that those materials from those types of animals is free of infectious agents. So it's a general requirement that everything from non-human primates or bats requires a permit from CDC. Next slide, please. So what I talked about earlier was largely infectious agents, substances, and vectors of disease. That is the vast majority of the requests that we receive. However, we do have a couple unique application types, and one is for live bats. So CDC, Division of Global Migration and Quarantine, regulates some animal species, live animals that come into the country. You'll hear more about that later. But the import permit program has been tasked with regulating live bats. It's a fairly uncommon request that we get, but any importation of live bats or transfer of previously imported live bats requires a permit from us. Also, this one is new. It just came out last year. This has to do with a realignment and how this is regulated at CDC. But human remains can require a permit from the CDC import program, but in a narrow range of cases. There's really two requirements here. The human remains have to be known or reasonably suspected to contain an infectious biological agent. And the second part that has to be fulfilled is that the remains have not been embalmed or cremated. So this is fairly rare, but we have issued a number of permits last year. Most of them related to COVID-19 or SARS-2. But it just seems that this is not generally transported, these particular materials. It just has to meet both criteria again, known or suspected to have the infectious agent and not embalmed or cremated. Next slide, please. Let's talk about how to actually go forward with applying for a permit. So I'll talk about our EIPP information system in the next series of slides. Next slide, please. All right, so here is kind of a high-level overview of our new information system. This came out in 2018. We made a series of investments into upgrading our information systems. And what we have here in the EIPP system is a cloud-based system. It's secure, it's user-friendly, much easier to use than previous systems. And essentially, it's a two-way portal for submitting and sharing information between our program and external applicants that are seeking to obtain a permit. On the right side, that's a picture of our homepage, and there's a link to that page if you were to apply for a permit or needed information on how to go about applying for a permit there. As I mentioned, this is a secure site, so we use what's known as CDC Secure Access Management Services, or SAMS account. This is used across a variety of CDC platforms, and if you already have a SAMS account for a different CDC application, you can use it for the import permit program. You just need to make a request to link that, and you can use our customer support request form to do that, or just to get a new account starting from scratch. I do want to emphasize that this system is mandatory, and anyone that is applying for a CDC import permit needs to submit their application in this system. Next slide, please. So there's a number of benefits that we've realized with this new system. So with the EIPP system, we see a faster processing time. There's no longer any manual data entry or sharing of different PDF forms. We've really streamlined that process. Applications can be approved, within a matter of hours or less in some cases. Also, for the external user, we have a renewal feature that basically just takes 2 clicks to initiate your renewal. It saves your information, you log in, open the application, you click the renew button, and it pulls it up and gets it ready for you to resubmit. You can still make edits at that time, but it saves the information and makes it much easier for users to do that. It's also a centralized location for all the information. It holds historical records of all permits and applications, so all of that's retained there. And then it really improves communication. We have real-time status updates on pending applications, so an applicant can log in to see what types of updates are there. We do have daily email updates that can be provided to users, and then we've also started deploying a read-only access level of review for CDC partners. That way they can authenticate and review information that's in the system to help them with their jobs as well. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we commonly get is how many permits are issued each year? So here's a summary of the last 5 years of the number of permits that have been issued. Typically, it's around 2,000, a little bit over 2,000 permits. But last year, as I mentioned, we had an unprecedented level in requests of SARS-CoV-2. That was the busiest year that I've ever seen. So we were much closer to 3,000 permits. And actually, I think that we're on track for between 3,000 to 4,000 permits in 2021 as the pandemic and research continues. Next slide, please. Also, another common question we get, this gets emailed frequently, and everyone wants to know how long does it take to get their permit. And I think a lot of this is due to our new system, the EIPP system. It's far more efficient, and all this is reported within calendar days. So within or less than 1 calendar day, a quarter of all applicants receive their approval or final disposition. So that's pretty quick. And then within 3 calendar days, over half of applicants have had their application processed. And then within 7 calendar days, we're over 3/4 of applicants have been approved at that point. So it's a fairly fast processing time. If it does take longer, that's generally due to a need for us to request more information. We may need clarification on a particular issue, or if it's an unusually complex application, it may have to go through additional levels of review, and that can add to the delay. So in the past, I believe we used to recommend people apply 60 to 90 days in advance. It's still a good idea to apply it early, probably 30 days at least, just to give yourself a buffer. But in most cases, these requests are approved pretty quickly. And I didn't mention this in the slide, but there's also, it's worth noting that there's no fee for the application for a CDC permit. Next slide, please. So I thought would be useful to show here is kind of our review process. What happens after an application is submitted, and what's the final disposition of the request that we received. So this is all data from last year, 2020. And if we look at it here, right about 92% of requests that we receive get approved and a permit is issued. So the vast majority, of permits issued if everything's in order, and we move forward from there. We do have about 3% of requests that after they're submitted, they ended up getting withdrawn by the applicant. So for whatever reason, they're no longer interested in pursuing it. Maybe we requested some additional information, or there's just a change in what their anticipated work was, and they withdrew the request. After that, we've got about 2% of applications we received were actually for cases where a permit's clearly not required. Some people aren't sure if a permit's needed, so they may submit an application, and in cases when we know it's not required, maybe it's eligible to be certified as non-infectious, or it's just outside our authority, we will close those applications and note that a permit's not required. After that, about 2% of applications get closed because we've had 30 days of no response. So we do issue a request for information for maybe about half of all requests that we get, but there are a small number of applicants that just never respond, and after 30 days of inactivity, we close out the applications. Less than 1% of permits that were issued have been revoked. This is a little bit higher than what we typically see, but I'll touch on that more later in the presentation, and there's some reasons for that. So these are permits that we've invalidated. They're not valid and can't be used anymore. After that, around 0.5% were closed, of applications were closed for other reasons. Maybe it was a duplicate or just some type of other odd classification as a reason to close it. And then only 0.1% of applications were actually denied. We generally don't have to deny these outright. There's usually a back and forth, a discussion with applicants about concerns, but in some very rare cases, it's just not appropriate for us to issue a permit, and we'll have to deny that particular request. And it's just worth noting that revocations or denials can be appealed, but that's just very rarely done. Next slide, please. So now I'll move on and talk about our inspection process. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we have one of our main tasks is to issue permits, but we also have inspections to help ensure compliance with the particular permits. So what happened was our regulations were revised back in 2013, and it was noted that issuance of a permit may be contingent upon an inspection of an importer's facilities for us to evaluate whether the biosafety measures are commensurate with the hazards posed given their intended use. So we can require an inspection before we issue a permit, but we also have a condition on all permits that we may do an inspection after issuance of a permit. So I just want to make that distinction. The inspection can be before or after issuance of a permit. But we're only looking at, we've only had an inspection for less than 10 years, so it's still somewhat of a new part of our program. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we review close to 2,000 to 3,000 applications and permits a year. Because of that volume, it's not possible for us to do inspections of all of these requests. So we have a risk-based approach, and we have actually a score that's calculated for an inspection risk score. So we have criteria that help us determine where we should spend our resources as far as inspecting. So not to give all the details away, but just to talk about some of the specifics, some of the things that we consider are the risk group of the agent. So you have risk groups 1 through 4 that are defined by the NIH guidelines and some other agencies as well. The higher the risk group, the higher the risk. We also look at the biosafety levels that were reported, so BSL 1 through BSL 4. 4 being the highest, and again, the higher the safety level, the higher the potential risk. So that's a large driving factor behind how we evaluate applications for inspection. Some of the other things that we look at are, will it be culture or propagation activities? Is the applicant going to work with animals or arthropods? That potentially increases the risk. We can look at the history of the importer. Are there any compliance issues that have been noted or reported by other agencies to us? And then lastly, we also consider the registration status with the Federal Select Agent Program. And that's to help us minimize any duplication of effort. Since we're all one division, we try to work together to provide the best oversight possible. Next slide, please. So as I was saying earlier, again, we have a responsibility to issue permits, but we also have an oversight responsibility for permit holders. The graph on the right just kind of shows in the first 5 years of our inspection program where the requests were being received. This parallels just the total number of requests that we see by state, but the most common requests are in California. We have a lot of biotech in that area, and universities, and then Maryland is also the highest, and that's largely because of the federal agencies that have an interest in working with imported infectious agents there. After California and Maryland, we have New York, Georgia, Florida, and Texas as being our highest levels of inspections and applicants. And then you can see we have a variety of other places scattered throughout the U.S. where we also do inspections as well. Part of our oversight responsibility is doing the inspections, but it's also activities like yesterday and today, the outreach and training opportunities. We do put on our own webinar on an annual basis, and we invite a variety of federal partners there as well. And then we have ongoing collaborations with other federal partners as we work to ensure oversight in this area. Next slide, please. So to talk about our inspections, the scope of our inspections can vary a little bit, but essentially what we're looking for is we're there to verify the biosafety measures are appropriate for the risks of the agent and the work. So we're looking at biosafety and biocontainment. We have some interest in security and other aspects, but it's really the biosafety that people can safely work with the material they're requesting to import. At the link that we have here, we have our checklists and policies available. They're posted on our website. It's all publicly available. It's been that way for many years. And a lot of our checklists are heavily influenced or even based upon the Biosafety and Biomedical Laboratories publication that's on the right side there. That's the newest 6th edition, which just came out late last year. It's put together by subject matter experts at CDC and NIH, and they've helped establish the standards of practice that should be used in these facilities that work with infectious agents. So we have specific things that we look at when we're on inspection related to safety. We're also there to verify information on the application. So it's one thing to review an application and approve it, but it's a different thing to physically go on site and see what's actually in place. So again, we're looking to verify that when we're on site. And then lastly, we're looking to see if the permittees comply with all conditions of the permit. Some permits have special conditions that need to be followed, and we verify that when we go on site. Next slide, please. Just a quick summary, we do issue an inspection report within 30 days of our inspection, and the vast majority of inspections require some type of corrective action. Here we found 93% in the first 5 years of our process. On average, there are about 6.5 findings, and it ranged from as low as 1 to as high as 33. So it can vary quite a bit. Next slide, please. And just to talk a little bit about the impact of inspections. So like I said, it was a relatively new part of our program. During the first 5 years, we did 184 inspections. Those were all on site. We had to revoke 12 permits for compliance reasons. And then there were 2 applications that were voluntarily withdrawn prior to approval and 2 that were denied after. Next slide.
We do have 5 minutes left in the presentation.
Okay, all right, I can wrap up in time. So just to briefly talk about the impact of 2020, obviously that's changed a lot of things for many people. We did suspend all of our on-site inspections in March because travel just wasn't feasible, but the following month we started 100% remote inspections in April. Our division did limit some on-site inspections in September of last year, but the import permit program is just starting to resume some on-site inspections this month. Next slide, please. And again, just a point about our information system that helped us get through the pandemic, working 100% through telework. And just on the graph on the right, in blue, you can see our average number of inspections, which is about 5 per month. The pandemic initially impacted us and made us cancel a number of inspections the first part of the year, but we were able to compensate that with the orange line in May, June, and through the summer with increased number of virtual inspections. Next slide. Just to briefly talk about the agenda, we now have a remote inspection process. We request documents about 2 to 3 weeks in advance. We have a presentation that's done remotely with virtual lab walkthroughs through photos, videos, floor plans. We still can do interviews and document review, and this is about 1 to 2 days on average. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, we'll skip past that. So next slide, please, now that we're on to SARS coronavirus 2. So just to talk about coronaviruses, obviously 2020 was a significant change for many people, but it's not uncommon for us to issue permits for coronavirus. There's 4 common human coronaviruses that are commonly used at BSL-2. We issue permits for them, and it's fairly standard. There's no special requirements. Back in 2003, when the first severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus came out, we did have special requirements we implemented, restricting distribution, which we're doing also in 2012 with Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus. Those novel exotic ones had some increased biosafety requirements. Also, just a quick note, these have positive stranded RNA genomes, so the total genome RNA is regulated in the same way as the virus, and it requires a separate permit for transfer of those SARS and MERS. Next slide, please. And just to touch on SARS coronavirus 2, it's not regulated as a select agent right now. CDC does recommend biosafety level 3 for virus isolation or culture, but BSL-2 can be allowed for limited diagnostics. We take a similar approach with this as we did with SARS and MERS, regulating the transfer, and basically anyone that wants to receive imported material needs a permit for transfer. Next slide, please. The one question we most commonly get is, when is it regulated? So SARS-CoV-2 that has been imported or subsequently transferred requires a permit from CDC. However, our regulations are limited to importation. Domestic cases or sample from domestic cases are not regulated and don't require a permit. Next slide, please. Here's just a quick summary of applications we saw. We had a very few in January. It continued to rise through the summer, but then trailed off in fall and late in 2020. What's not on the graph is 2021, but we've actually seen more requests for SARS-CoV-2 in 2021 with the emergence of variants. So we've actually been busier this year than we were last year. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this just in the interest of time, but we issued close to 700 permits, and most of them were approved, but we did have to revoke a few number, and that had to largely do with inspection issues for people not having things on their application that weren't in place. Next slide, please. So just in summary, CDC requires a permit to import infectious biological agents or substances or vectors of disease. There's no fee to apply for a permit. We generally approve permits within 3 days, so it's pretty quick. And we do conduct inspections to verify compliance. And next slide, and that should wrap it up for me today.
Thank you so much. I do see some questions in the chat function. Please be sure to add your questions if you have them. Adam, which question do we have to answer?
There's actually 4 in there, so I'll start with the first one, and if we don't get to them in time, Mary, we'll definitely get back to the people who asked them. The first question from Joshua Terse, any progress on a proxy access role for BSOs or similar roles to see imports permits for an entire institution?
Excellent question. That's something we're trying to work on, the proxy access and involving more people. Honestly, it's probably at least another year away, though. Right now, we're working on an inspection module to integrate into the system, since that's something we don't currently have for EIPP. So that's the focus for right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir. Another question from Marie-Louise Faber. Is there a list similar to the export control list ECCN 1C353 that CDC uses for import to track not only pathogens and toxins, but also components, genes, DNA fragments that may be regulated? That's a very specific question. I like it.
So that's a great question. We've been hesitant to put out a list because we don't want it to infer that it's limited to just those things. The emergence of SARS-2 is a great, example of why it's very broad and open. The short answer is no, there's not a list. However, we are working on development in the system to work on what we're calling a smart agents type of listing, where we will have defined agents in there that people can select from. Because right now we're not list-based, but we can get to a modifiable starting point that's list-based and expand it and kind of have a curated list of agents. So it's something we're working on. It's not quite out right now, but it could be out in the future.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is from Rebecca Maloney. Where applicable, do you inquire or request evidence of institutional approval for the work as part of the permitting inspection process, asking as a BSO at a university?
That's a good question. We do request for contact information for the BSO. We found it's difficult to actually make that a required field. It's differences in the agencies. What I would say in the application review process, we may request it, we generally don't, but during the inspection process, we would look at IBC approvals or Animal Care and Use Committee approvals. So it's a little bit up in the air. It could be required, but it's generally going to be preserved for inspection where we get into that level of detail.
Excellent, thank you. And then the last question, I think there might be one that came, there's a few more that came in while we're talking, but I'll ask this one while from Nairi Mortensen. For CDC import permits, if a permittee has a stipulation in their permit that any subsequent distribution within the U.S. requires a separate permit, should the original permittee retain a copy of the permits from individuals to whom the material is sent, in addition to placing a copy with the shipping documents?
Yeah, I would recommend that. It's not specifically spelled out, but if you have that condition on your permit that you can't share it without the other recipient having a permit, please request a copy of it and maintain it on file with your own records. That will show that you've done your due diligence and have complied with the terms of the permit.
There was a question, what is the number of inspectors for an on-site inspection team?
Typically 2. For larger entities, we may bring 3. That's smaller. The Federal Select Agent Program, I think, is anywhere from 2 to 10 inspectors. But we're generally around 2 inspectors when we go on site.
Thank you for that, sir. And then the last one that I've got in there is a CDC permit needed for importation of Salmonella, E. coli, Campi, etc. of animal origin.
So yes, if it's isolates or cultures that came from animals, that would be needed. If those are agents that were diagnostic samples from animals, they could. It's a bit of an overlap issue. So USDA may have an interest for the animal health, but CDC has an interest for human health.
And I think that's it, Mary, and I appreciate those answers, sir. I'm typing those all up, and I will get all that over to you, Mary. So,
Great, thank you so much. All right, moving on, our next speaker from U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Mr. Michael Valenzuela.